Okay, cool. So, good morning, everyone, and happy Tuesday. I hope you're all well. Thank you for joining us this morning for the monthly Selesti webinar instalment. My name is Kate. I'm a digital marketing strategist here at Selesti. I will be looking after you this morning, where we'll be joined by Matt, digital strategy director at Selesti, as we break down the technical aspects of how Google search works, discussing its key ranking factors and its development over time. If you have any questions for Matt throughout the talk, please pop them in the Q&A tab and we'll answer these at the end. The presentation will be shared with you afterwards, including any relevant notes/takeaways. So let's get started. I'll pass you over to Matt.
Good morning. I'm just going to share my screen, so give me one moment. And we'll get cracking. Okay. Excellent. So yes, good morning. Thank you ever so much for joining us all today. I must say, when we did the first of these webinars about this time last year, I hoped we'd be able to do these in person by now, but hopefully we'll be able to do that soon. So as Kate said, I'm Matt. I'm the Digital Strategy Director at Selesti, and the topic of today's talk is to kind of give a bit of an overview of how Google search has changed over the years, and look at what sort of the current key ranking factors are, and perhaps a bit of a trend of how we can see how things are going to move to in the future. For those of you that don't know, as Selesti, we work with a wide variety of B2C and B2B brands, from local businesses up to large multinationals, sort of delivering digital marketing campaigns backed by data across a wide variety of channels, with the idea of helping our clients grow and achieve their business goals. We've also recently become B Corp certified, which I believe makes us the first Google Premier Partner Agency to achieve B Corp status. It's something that we're really proud of. And if you'd like some more information about it, or indeed looking to discuss your own journey, then please do let us know, because our team are more than happy to talk you through the often, as we say, challenging process, but certainly worthwhile. And hopefully at the end of this talk, you'll have some sort of thought starters and some discussion points as well to go away and sort of think about for your own websites and your own business. So without further ado, we'll kind of crack on. So we're not going to cover every single ranking factor that Google uses to determine where a site should be ranked. Particularly, most SEOs would suggest there's over 200 ranking factors, so it will take us a bit of time. However, again, the idea is to give you an overview of the key ranking factors and explain a bit about the impact of certain changes you can make to your website, as well as looking at kind of how Google has developed, particularly over the last decade or so. So kind of the key question is how did we get from this, where we were kind of 10 years ago, and also 20 years ago, and how Google looked, to where we are now. So right from the start, Google's aim has always been to develop the quickest and most precise web search in the world for that sector of their business. And over the years, the company's continued to focus on improving its searches and offering its users the best and most relevant results possible from across the web. And if we look at Google's business model for search, it's really important for them that organic searches are seen as a reliable, trustworthy source of information, ensuring users continue to use the service and ultimately enabling Google to sell ads as well. And any changes Google has made to their algorithm, and they make about 500 a year, people estimate, are designed to improve the reliability of search and ensure users are getting the results that they need, which is kind of how we've got to what search engine results pages look like today. And it's why they're consistently adding new features and updating the algorithm to give better results. You can see here sort of a bit of a timeline from '98, when Google.com was registered and accessed information for everybody, to all of the little features and things that they've added into search to make it sort of overall a better user experience and being able to provide people with better results and sort of more varied results, I guess. And it's why they continue to add new features. Now, Google, particularly now, doesn't often share details of their algorithm updates, but there's certainly some highlights, particularly from the last decade or so, that are worth discussing, as they help to kind of give context to the decisions that Google makes, and also how search has improved and kind of got smarter over the years. So we're just going to talk a little bit about each of those. So starting in sort of 2011, I guess is probably a good place to start. And when we talk about Panda, so this was initially rolled out in 2011 and brought into the core algorithm in about 2016. And essentially it's designed to drive better quality content across the web. So potential pitfalls for this part of the algorithm could include sort of duplicate content, plagiarized content, or thin, low quality content, I think it would be say, and sort of things around user generated spam, or in the old days where people used to be able to stuff loads of keywords onto a website to rank well, it was designed to kind of combat that as well. And it's why it's really important to run regular checks on your website for content duplication and sort of identify thin content that you could improve as well. If we move on to Penguin, this was another big one in 2012. This was about 2 years after I first started working in SEO, actually. So I do recall this, and lots of people may recall that it caused quite a challenge for many sites. So, you know, the objective of it was to ultimately downrank sites on natural backlinks. So we're talking about people who are buying links or using link farms, that kind of thing, and they certainly suffered. And that really, in the long run, is only a good thing for search. And to continue to stay safe for this part, it's important that we monitor our link profile, ensure that link building efforts are sort of ethical and relevant to your site and your audience, allowing you to grow it in a kind of a natural way, as opposed to probably peak in the early 2000s, where you could essentially buy 10,000 links from a dodgy directory somewhere, and it would naturally help you improve your ranking. With Hummingbird, and when it was added to the algorithm, the intention was to ultimately help Google and Google search better interpret queries, providing better results that match intent behind a user's search. And this is something that Google have done more and more of since then, really. You know, it uses sort of natural language processing to help better understand the user's search. And I think it's probably one of the larger steps forward into the kind of the way that search works today that we see. And this was kind of the starting point for that. And it's why it's kind of moving beyond, when we're looking at keyword research, to perhaps focus on the overall idea, or indeed the overall concepts behind the keyword, as opposed to just a single keyword on its own. If we move forward into 2015, and again, this is something that many people may recall at the time, some SEOs referred to it as Mobile-ageddon, which was a bit much, I thought personally, but nonetheless, this rolled out in 2015, and it's ultimately as a response to users shifting to access the Web3 mobile devices with more regularity. And again, as we know, Google wants to provide the best results for users, so naturally, if there is a trend for users using mobile more often, then clearly the algorithm is going to shift to address that. And this update, along with sort of subsequent tweaks and improvements, have now essentially completely shifted the focus from desktop to mobile sites. Indeed, Google now ranks all websites mobile first, meaning that having a well-optimized mobile site will invariably sort of help your efforts in Google search. We go on to RankBrain in 2015, and this was brought in to kind of further improve the search engine understanding of the meaning behind a user's query. It uses machine learning to help better understand and kind of provide a customized result for users. Essentially, you know, it's further allowed Google to go beyond a person's individual search query and instead take into account the wider context, synonyms, implied words, and your personal search history. It's why I may get an entirely different result for a given search than some of you on this call. Again, it's all about making search smarter. In May 2018, I'm sure lots of you will probably recall this, we saw a very large update, which is sort of termed the Medic update. And it sort of disproportionately, I would say, affected sites which have information around potentially life-altering decisions. So things like finance, law, education, and health. We call these your money, your life sites. It is suggested that it kind of links directly to Google's quality guidelines, which are called EAT. So does it show expertise? Does it show authority? And is the website trustworthy? And it really highlights the importance of ensuring that the content you produce is reliable, factually accurate, and ultimately seen as a trusted source of information, particularly if you're working in sectors like health, finance, law, or education. If we move on to BERT in 2019, I think we can kind of see this as almost accumulation of Google's efforts to understand the nuance behind a searcher's query. Again, using natural language processing to better understand queries and identify relationships between certain entities. Essentially, this kind of now means, and this is where we are today really, is like never before, it's really important to create meaningful copy that's going to add value to a user's search and help them sort of ultimately have their needs met. Now, in recent years, Google have started to refer to bigger updates as core updates, which typically means there's a bit less transparency from Google about what the updates are and what they are designed to improve. But ultimately, the only way to really ascertain the impact of this is by monitoring your positions in search engine results pages along with your organic traffic, and also keeping an eye on Search Console as well. But if we look at the previous updates and perhaps the ones that we have a bit more information about, we can see that the direction Google is moving in. You know, again, Google only wants to send users to a site that effectively answers a query, you know, that they're searching for in the best way. So by ensuring that your website is providing relevant results for users and a best-in-class experience, you can, you know, still rank well. And we have a few thoughts on areas to look at in the coming slides, and particularly as a top-level view of common issues and sort of factors. However, to immediately contradict what I just said regarding transparency and core updates, Google have announced that there's going to be a page experience update rolling out on mobile first in May of this year. Now, officially, the line from Google at the moment is that this is going to be one more factor to add to the list. And it is believed from sort of recent reports and interviews with people at Google that it's likely to initially be rolled out in quite a moderate fashion. However, I think it's certainly something to keep front of mind, particularly if you're operating in a really competitive space where having a best-in-class page experience may be a deciding factor in achieving really good rankings. At the moment, if you go into your search console, there is a report on there called the Core Web Vitals Report, which directly links to this update, and it scores your website on various different metrics, and that's a really good starting point to ascertain if your site is kind of providing a brilliant experience for users. So, having heard me talk about all of these different algorithm updates and the various sort of vagaries of it, your next question is probably, well, how can I stay on top of all of this? There's so much going on. One, in short, that's often why people use agencies like us, to have a whole team of people staying up to date and taking care of SEO considerations. However, there's certainly a few areas to bear in mind when looking at key factors. Typically, if you're not doing some of these following areas I'm going to discuss, then you're likely to struggle. So there's a few things to consider. Here you can see them on the screen. I'm going to aim to give you a brief overview of some of these. And again, this list is by no means exhaustive. As I mentioned earlier, there's probably over 200 ranking factors, but these are sort of really good things to consider. And the idea is that it gives a few ideas, a few thought starters to kind of go away, think about, am I doing this? Is my site achieving this? Is it ticking these boxes? And this is kind of a really good foundation to kind of start your journey if you're sort of, or indeed if you're already on your journey, sort of to improving your site's SEO, to look at these things and sort of see if you are doing them, essentially. So as we've kind of mentioned, and throughout the development of the algorithm, the development of high quality content is of vital importance to give you the best chance of ranking well. And there's some good pointers on this, which is to ensure that it's unique, it's adding value to the conversation around a certain topic, it's adding value to the user. It's really well structured in terms of sort of header tags and on-page optimization, and has like a really clear thread throughout. So, a really clear start. It's almost like writing an essay when you were at school, really. A clear introduction, some points to make, and a really clear conclusion. There's three, in our opinion, really good questions to ask yourself when it comes to content. And that is it useful? Is it relevant? And does it relate to the user journey or help the user in some way? If you're answering all of these yes, the chances are that your content probably is quite high quality. If you're answering some of these questions no, then it's probably worth reviewing your content and seeing how you can improve it more. And of course, and we'll talk about this a little bit later as well, but of course it's always really useful to try and do some keyword research to ensure that people are actually interested in what you're writing about and they're actually searching for it as well. If we go on to backlinks, this is something that Google says, and it's well known, and as we've kind of talked about already, essentially, if you don't have a backlink profile, you're going to really struggle to rank well. And Google sees these as a natural indicator of a site's authority. A backlink from a trusted source is immensely valuable. However, as we've already discussed, and we look at the Panda update and the core updates that have happened since, getting it wrong can be immensely damaging. You might find yourself with a manual penalty, and some people may recall years ago that happened to Interflora as a good example, and this can be quite challenging to recover from that. So it's really important you do it in an ethical, reasonable way, I suppose. And some good tactics to help build backlinks is to review your own backlink profile, see what's in there, see what sort of demons are lurking in the closet. You can use a tool like Majestic SEO and also review your competitors' activity using a similar tool to kind of identify potential opportunities for yourself, see what your competitors are up to, and kind of identify gaps to take advantage of. Typically at Selesti, when we're doing this sort of work for clients, we use sort of things like outreach and digital PR to achieve really good backlinks from relevant publications. We'll kind of try and plan activity on a quarterly campaign basis with large-scale hero pieces. It could be something like a survey, for instance, followed up with several pillar pieces to reach out with. When trying to place this type of content, when trying to outreach, it's really important to consider your user personas, but also identify what would be of interest to your target publications. What we often like to do, if it's possible, is to try and contact relevant journalists, relevant contacts throughout that process to solicit feedback and kind of ensure that your outreach activity has the best chance of success. Ultimately, you want it to get placed with these people, so why not get in contact with them and sort of get some feedback from them. And again, there's plenty of tools out there you can subscribe to where you can sort of have journal alerts or people when people are looking for comment on a particular story in a particular sector. Again, that's a really good opportunity to kind of get a valuable backlink to your site. If we move on to search intent, and as we've kind of alluded to when talking about how Google kind of ranks sites at the moment, they're trying to get smarter and smarter about the actual intent behind a user's search. You know, trying to uncover the why behind each search, and it's a really, really good mindset to get into. It will really help focus your SEO and content efforts, and also just generally ensuring you're focusing on the user. Now, there's sort of different ways you can define intent. There's a few ideas here. So when we talk about transactional intent, this could be when the users are directly searching for something to buy or sort of inquire about. So a search for this could be something like, I don't know, buy Callaway golf balls online, which is a regular search of mine as I play golf and lose a lot of golf balls. If we move on to informational intent, you know, a large amount of these type of searches are people looking for information. This could be recipes, the weather, or the latest raft of lockdown rules. You know, as we've already discussed, Google's understanding of intent has kind of moved far beyond just a keyword focus, but it may be, you know, it can help understand that people who are searching for something like shepherd's pie are probably more likely to be looking for recipes as opposed to information about the dish itself. So again, it will serve results like focusing on recipes or how to cook a shepherd's pie as opposed to a Wikipedia article about the dish itself. If we move on to navigational intent, you know, people with this kind of intent typically want to be visiting a specific website. They already know where they want to go. So it might be people searching for like a brand term. So if you're searching Twitter, the chances are that you want to visit twitter.com as opposed to finding information about the company. And then finally, we sort of talk about commercial intent, and I've sort of said commercial investigatory intent here, because these type of searches tend to be a bit higher in the buying funnel. So they're looking for information to help inform a particular purchase. So this could be searches like, I don't know, highest rated cricket gear or best value washing machine 2021. Essentially, these searches do have transactional intent as well, but they're just a bit higher up in the funnel. They need some convincing. So it's a really good opportunity for you to persuade them to use your service or buy your product by creating a blog article or piece of content that kind of reviews certain things or explains why your solution, your product is a really good option compared to others. As I'm sure you've had many SEOs mentioned in the past, and as we've kind of talked about a lot, I think on previous webinars, but page speed continues to be a highly important ranking factor. And in fact, the forthcoming page experience update is essentially a lot of the core web vital stuff is focused around how a site loads. So not only is it going to be important for SEO, because again, Google only want to send people to high quality websites, but it's also going to have an impact on your site's conversion rate. After all, nobody likes using a slow site. It's a real nightmare. You can use tools sort of like Lighthouse or Google PageSpeed Insights to get an idea of how your site is performing, and typically it will need some development support to help fix these issues. But some issues we commonly see is some things around how JavaScript performs on the site. Unoptimized images is quite a popular one. It's where people are uploading sort of huge images that might be taken on an SLR without compressing first. It's a real quick win for page speed, and you can use lossless compression to sort this. So there's some free tools like TinyPNG, which can help you with this. Things around sort of lack of caching, bulky code as well, potentially if you can streamline your code. Clearly the site will hopefully load faster. Or often, and particularly on WordPress, we quite often see situations where people have too many plugins. So again, typically, you know, plugins get added to a site over time, and some of those may now be redundant or no longer needed. So if you can streamline that as much as possible, it will invariably help your loading speed as well. If we go on to mobile, and as I said earlier, Google now indexes mobile first. So unsurprisingly, if your mobile site is non-existent or poorly optimized, then you're likely to struggle, in my opinion. So it's really important to ensure that your mobile page speed is up to scratch. But you know, you may also want to consider other things. You know, fully responsive design is typically the best way to go. Looking at tap targets, so people with fat thumbs like me can still navigate your site. Looking at font size for readability purposes. Looking at the menu structure. So again, is it easier to navigate on mobile? You may wish to put in a hamburger menu on mobile as opposed to on desktop. You may have a traditional kind of drop-down menu. And also, particularly on mobile, I would always suggest trying to avoid pop-ups, because typically they're quite difficult to sort of exit, and it kind of interrupts the user experience a little bit on mobile. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but again, just some kind of thought starters and things for you to review when looking at your own mobile experience. As we know, and I think I've kind of touched on this before, but Google considered site security to be a real crucial ranking factor now. Ultimately, if your site is not on HTTPS, then sort it out. Then you must ensure that you are as a matter of urgency. And you can also review some of your current security headers to add an additional layer of security. There's loads of new ones coming out all the time. Again, this is by no means a full list. In fact, Jamie, our technical director, could probably do a whole webinar on site security. So if you'd be interested in that, let us know, and we'll get him to do one. But there's a few here where you can look at things like content security policy that you can implement in your header. It's a really effective measure to protect your site from attacks. By whitelisting source approved content, you can kind of prevent a browser from loading potentially malicious assets. If you look at X-frame options, it tells the browser whether you want your site to be framed or not. So this, again, by preventing the browser from framing your site, you can defend against attacks like sort of clickjacking and that kind of thing. Referrer policy is actually a fairly newer header, which allows a site to control how much information the browser includes with navigations away from a document. It's probably best practice to set this policy for all sites. And then permissions policy is a new header that allows a site to control which features and APIs can be used in the browser. So by locking down certain things, again, you can protect your site security a bit more. Again, no means a full list, but we can certainly provide a bit more information on that if people are interested. But if you'd like to test your own security headers, then a site like securityheaders.com is free to use and will give you a very simple score from sort of A to F based upon sort of how secure your site is, and give you some advice on what headers you might want to recommend. If we look at site structure, the way your site is structured helps give Google a really clear indicator of kind of how to crawl your site and what pages you consider to be the most important. And also, you kind of want a really good site architecture because it makes it easier to use as well. So you might want to look at areas like internal linking. How do your pages interlink? Google will follow internal links to discover content on websites and to rank that content in search results. Essentially, if a page has several links pointing towards it, then it is a signal to Google that it's an important and a high value page on your site. With regards to cannibalization, sometimes the way a site is structured can lead to some issues where you're essentially trying to rank pages for a similar keyword or group of keywords and essentially competing against yourself. So ideally, you should be aiming to look at each page for a specific target term or group of terms in a very sort of structured manner to ensure all of your efforts are focused in sort of the right directions. And again, when we're looking at user flows, it's important for UX and for your overall site structures to consider this and have that ideal user flow for various personas, particularly if we look at the search intent we were talking about earlier. Clearly, user flow for someone who's at a more of a research sort of investigatory stage is a little bit different from someone who's searching for Callaway golf balls, where I'm in a stage where I actually just want to get straight to the product. So considering that in your site structure and the way people move through your site, it's a really good state of mind to get into. And then looking at your URL structure, typically, particularly on large e-commerce sites, URL structure can become a bit convoluted and quite extensive, and it's sort of best practice to have a really clear hierarchical URL structure to help both users and search engines understand the overall topic of a page. Best practice in a nutshell is to keep your URLs and folder structure as simple and logical as possible. If we move on to keyword optimization, as we've kind of discussed and looking at the various updates, looking for the type of keywords to rank for is really, really useful. Initially, we would always suggest kind of performing some keyword research to discover what users are searching for and ensure that you're matching content and your site experience to the intent behind the search. As I said earlier, Google's moved beyond just, individual searches for specific key terms and is getting better and better at understanding the context behind a user's search, which means that us as marketeers have to become better and better at meeting those needs for users because the expectation is there. And once you've decided upon your target terms, then it's, some on-page optimization. So looking at meta titles, header tags, and your wider content for the term, considering the keyword density throughout your copy. Most SEOs would suggest sort of ideally a 1% keyword density. So that's how often your target term appears in your copy. And that's to kind of avoid keyword stuffing and that sort of very old school early 2000s tactic of just shoving loads of keywords in the copy and you'll rank. And it's also to ensure that you can target perhaps longer tail searches in your body copy as well. And again, it's something that's always worth doing, but looking at competitors, seeing what they are appearing for. If they're appearing higher than you in Google search for a given term, then it's worth looking at their page, how they're optimizing it, and trying to sort of take some advice from that as what's things you can emulate or improve upon their offering to improve your own position as well. And that's particularly useful, particularly useful for highly competitive terms where there's loads of people searching for it. Looking at what competitors are up to is a really valuable sort of worthwhile endeavour. As we've seen from sort of the various updates that Google have made and as I kind of keep reiterating, I will continue to do so, is that Google only wants to send people to websites that are providing a great user experience and answering their terms. So they're becoming smarter at measuring UX as we know. And brilliantly, yes, if you have a great UX, it's going to help you in SEO, but it will also benefit you for your overall site's conversion rate. And this trend from Google is only likely to continue over time as the algorithm and everything becomes smarter and smarter. Again, a few things that perhaps you might want to consider here, but in my opinion, one of the most valuable things you can do is sort of perform user testing or A/B testing to ensure that your site is effectively meeting a user's needs. This is something we do regularly for lots of clients at Selesti, and some of the findings are really useful to identify, and sometimes surprising, frankly, to identify user pain points or perhaps a better way of formatting content on the site, for instance. There's some great tools available to do that. Google Optimize is a free tool you can implement it through Tag Manager. It allows you to perform A/B testing, or usertesting.com is really good for remote user testing at the moment, particularly as we can't really do it in person. And it might also be worth looking at installing some other tracking on your site, such as Hotjar or Lucky Orange, to get a real sense of how people are using your website. Again, you may be quite surprised. And of course, it's also really good to consistently review your analytics and identify any problem pages. These could be pages with an abnormally high bounce rate, a low engagement rate, or a surprisingly low conversion rate. It can kind of help pinpoint areas of your site that you might want to test and learn from over time to improve. And finally, sort of tech SEO. So yes, the algorithm and the core algorithm and everything is getting smarter and smarter at measuring sites, but there are still technical best practices that must be adhered to. So again, there's a huge list of this stuff, and this is another webinar in itself, frankly. But trying to avoid 404 pages, make sure your on-page elements are unique and relevant to the user, checking that your sort of sitemap XML and robots.txt files are formatted correctly, looking at sort of redirects and ensure all of that's in place, looking at your implementation of canonical tags, and then looking at JavaScript crawling. And again, this is probably a wider discussion for another one, but if your site uses a lot of JavaScript, Google can sometimes struggle to crawl it. For Google, it can be a much more longer process. Essentially, Googlebot will download the HTML file. It won't find any links in the source code, as they're only injected after the JavaScript. So Googlebot will then download the CSS JavaScript files and then use a web rendering service to sort of compile and execute that JavaScript, fetch the data, and then index the content. Essentially, in a nutshell, it's a big faff for Google to crawl JavaScript, but you can use something called dynamic rendering to help with this, and it's something that Google sort of recommended as the approved method for this process. And essentially, this is where you serve users a fully featured JavaScript website, but at the same time, your server will send Google a static version of your website, thus making it easier to crawl. Again, there's loads more to consider when it comes to tech SEO. But again, just a few thought starters and things for people to start thinking about here. And the best way of checking the technical health of your site is to perform a full SEO audit using tools like Screaming Frog, looking at Search Console, looking at SEMrush, and that will help to identify problems and kind of allow you to fix them in a priority order. So that's it. I hope you found it useful and kind of have a better understanding a little bit of how Google search analyzes your website and decides where to place it. As I mentioned, this is by no means an exhaustive analysis of everything, because that webinar is probably about 15 hours long, and you don't want to hear me talk for that long. But again, hopefully a good starting point for those looking to improve their site's SEO. And if you do have any questions, please let us know in the chat below, or feel free to email us as well, and we'll get back to you. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Matt. So let's take a little look at the Q&A section. Okay, so first question we have is, which of the algorithm updates had the biggest impact on search rankings?
Oh, well, I think if we go back to the earlier ones, I would say the biggest ones, I think that made the biggest waves in SEO was probably Panda, Penguin, and then Hummingbird as well, because for me, I think Hummingbird is the start of sort of Google's journey into where it is now in terms of trying to understand the sort of context and the sort of the context behind a user search, really. But I'd say sort of Panda, Penguin, and Hummingbird is kind of the basis of where we're heading to today, really. So those three together, I would suggest, had the biggest impact. I think in terms of what people probably saw as the biggest impact, I'd say Panda, because it stopped a lot of people you know, in terms of trying to basically get better content on the web, which is only a good thing. What do you think, Nods?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, you're going to see the biggest impact with those initial ones, because that was when they really worked to change the algorithm. Because, you know, there used to be, you'd put keywords in, you have meta keywords, which is really old fashioned, and any website could put in keywords. And I know that there was quite an issue in Google where you'd search for something very innocent and be bombarded with porn. So yeah, that definitely had a big impact, like really looking into the content and everything. All of the updates really moving forwards, Google always just say focus on really great content, focus on your user, and you'll do really well. It's just, they're just bolt-ons to those other updates from previously. So yeah, absolutely. Cool. The second question is, what is the most important element to optimize for SEO?
It depends, is the classic SEO answer for that. But ultimately, I think you won't go far wrong if, particularly now, if in your mind you're kind of putting the user first. It's probably a really good mindset to get into. So yes, all of the technical stuff has to be there and the foundations have to be there, because if not, you're really going to struggle. But if you are creating content, building a website that effectively answers your target audience's needs, and is fast to load and easy to use, all of those great things, that will probably stand you in fairly good stead as a good starting point, I would say. And yes, there's loads of other stuff you can add to that, but the basis is if you put the user first, you provide a great experience for them and effectively answer the intent behind their search, you'll probably be in a pretty good situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, it depends is the perfect answer to that question, really. The size of your site will affect it. You're not going to spend absolutely ages doing loads of technical SEO fixes on a smaller site. If you've got a bigger site, you could see insane increases just from doing your technical side of things. So yeah, it really does depend on multiple levels.
And a lot of it kind of depends what's already wrong with your site from an SEO perspective. You might have a great technical foundation, but rubbish content, in which case then clearly your area of focus would be content, but equally it could be the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. Always cover everything. Okay, so we've also got a question. What are the best steps to take to recover from a penalty? I'm hoping this is just someone asking and not someone who's received a penalty.
It depends on the penalty, of course. I mean, if we're talking about a manual penalty, then clearly that's quite often around links. And that is if you have been doing some dodgy practices, then A, stop. B, if you've really been doing it badly, it's worth looking at the disavow tool for that, and sort of disavowing the clearly spammy and dodgy links that you bought. And then really going forward, the focus has then got to be on doing it the right way. So, as we kind of discussed earlier on in the webinar, looking at ways of building natural backlinks in the right way, as opposed to sort of perhaps dodgy practices that some people have done. And that's typically when you see a manual penalty, it generally tends to be around links.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just trying to make sure that you're cleaning up your act. It can take a long time to recover from a penalty. So you, as a broader sort of marketing strategy, obviously you'll have to focus on those other areas, maybe social, maybe a bit of paid marketing, just to make sure that you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in the meantime, it's definitely worth doing that. I mean, essentially, manual penalty is Google prison. So you've got to serve a bit of time, and then basically prove you're worthy to be released back into SEO society.
Yeah. Okay, so next question. Do pop-up cookie policies negatively affect SEO?
Not, depending on how you implement them. Typically, no. As long as you're implementing in the right way, Google's aware that has to be in place, essentially. Also depends on how you're treating the pop-up. So if it's appearing like in the middle of the page, or linking off elsewhere, that's probably not best practice. Your best bet is typically to have it in the footer, or sort of at the top in the header. Most sites tend to have it in the footer now. And again, it's sort of best practice in the web. And as we know, Google only kind of wants to direct people to websites that are showing good practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't remember the exact date, but Google did run an update where they sort of banned, or they negatively affected websites for any obtrusive interstitials. So I think the idea is just to ensure that it's not taking up too much of that space. You don't want a full page pop-up. Pop-ups aren't the worst. I know that for marketing, they can be really beneficial. So your newsletter sign-up pop-ups. But most programs now will make sure that those pop-ups appear after you've navigated 3 pages, or you've been on the site for a particular amount of time, which won't be an issue for SEOs, only when they appear as soon as you land on the page.
It's essentially only if anything, a cookie pop-up, or indeed a different type of pop-up, if it's basically incredibly vulgar and then takes up the whole page, because that's a rubbish user experience and not useful for anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that kind of brings me on to the last question that I have here, which is, how does Google review user experience?
Well, some of it is a mystery, frankly, because Google don't announce it. I think it's safe to presume that some people suggest that bounce rate is one. It's not one that Google have never said that actually is. Some SEOs still suggest that. I'm not entirely sure I agree with it. I think at the moment, a lot of it is going to be focusing on this core web vitals that are coming, and that is focusing on page speed. Clearly, sort of click-through rate as well can have an impact. And ultimately, it's good to just kind of put yourself in the mindset of if your site is fast, if it answers a need, then Google will probably consider that a great user experience. If people aren't clicking on your SERP, then that's probably a signal to Google that that's not that relevant for users. If you're ranking number 5 or in the top 3 and people are skipping it, it's got a poor click-through rate. Again, Google might consider that to not necessarily be the best sort of site to rank for that key term. But there's loads of different things, and again, I think Google don't tell us all of it, and there's certainly been some studies done on it which suggest some people just the bounce rate is a factor, some people don't. It's very much a sort of discussion point, but ideally, I think if we just provide a great user experience, you won't go far wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that there are rumblings in the SEO community that have said basically that Google might be looking at dwell time on a page.
Yeah.
But really the user experience of a site, I don't agree with the bounce rate theory at all, just because if you're looking at a single page web page, then the bounce rate, you are going to bounce from it, but you might have done everything that you needed to. You might have filled in a form on that page. You might be really connecting with this brand, but you're not navigating through the site. So yeah, unfortunately, apart from sort of like the core web vitals, which is just user experience based, Google haven't provided any information to us as to how they would track user experience, but it is an important factor and it's somewhere in the algorithm.
I think a good thing to look at is, so we don't know exactly how Google tracks it, but if you're looking at your own analytics and your conversion rate's rubbish, on pages that you don't want people to bounce off, if you're looking for more or less informational search, or you want people to explore your site, the bounce rate's really high when people land on those pages, all that kind of thing, it's probably an indicator that your site isn't providing a good user experience as well. So it's maybe not trying to please Google. If you try and please your users, the chances are that you will also please Google. It's kind of
That's got to be the perfect finishing thought. Always focus on your user first. Don't think about Google. Well, do think about Google, but don't think about them first. Anyways, so yeah, that's great. If you guys have any additional questions, obviously pop them in, but I haven't seen any pop through for now, so thank you so much for attending, and if you think of any other additional questions after the talk, then please feel to pop us an email and we'll be happy to answer those for you. Our next event details will be shared with you soon alongside the presentation slides from today. The next digital surgery session run by Selesti will be taking place next Tuesday on the 9th of March with Ricardo Hatoum from Quad Financial to discuss the one-person marketing show. We've put the link in the chat function, so don't forget to sign up. And lastly, please do head over to LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter to give us a follow at Selesti, where you can keep up to date with everything. See you again soon.